Think about a world where China's President Xi Jinping's big hopes come true. A world where China not only questions, but totally overthrows the current order of things in the world, becoming the global leader. Instead of just getting rid of the US, China would rule over every country in the world. It might be a fantasy, but it makes us think about what would happen if there was such a big change in the balance of power in the world. The Chinese president has worked hard for 30 years to modernize the country, turning it from an isolated and poor country into a strong player on the world stage. China is now an economic and military powerhouse that is slowly but surely eroding the Western control that Xi wants to end. It might make sense for China to lead the world, but let's go one step further. What would life be like if China controlled the whole world and no other countries were allowed to share the stage? First, let's talk about the government. Once China takes over, all countries will have to deal with major changes in their political processes. China has been communist since 1949, when Mao Zedong took power and made the People's Republic of China. This change would come from that history. Now that we are in the present, President Xi is in charge of the Chinese Communist Party, which runs with only one party. In this global situation, no party group would question the CCP's power or rule. A huge change in the way the world is governed would have effects all over the world. A 2019 study from the Pew Research Center found that out of the 167 countries they looked at in 2017, most, 57%, were considered democratic, which means that the people had the power to choose their leaders through fair elections. Another 28% were a strange mix of democracy and dictatorship, a system that took parts from both. With its almost regular polls, Russia might be seen as a democratic front. On the other hand, these elections were marred by fraud, which made sure that autocratic rule won, even though it looked like democracy. If China were to take over the whole world, there would be no need for political groups. Of the world's 8.1 billion people, only one boss would be chosen for them. Voting wouldn't go away completely, though. China's constitution says, all citizens of the People's Republic of China who have reached the age of 18, regardless of ethnicity, race, gender, occupation, family background, religious belief, level of education, property status, or length of residence, shall have the right to vote and stand for election. Persons deprived of political rights in accordance with law shall be an exception. But how would voting work if in this world, China, there are no parties that can stand up to the CCP? They stayed powerful because it is very well organized. Though Xi Jinping is known as China's president, it is his job as General Secretary of the CCP that gives him real power. With more than 89 million followers in China alone, the party already includes a big chunk of the 1.42 billion people who live in the country. Now, let's quickly figure things out. With 8.1 billion people living in a world controlled by China, the CCP would grow by about 5.78 times, hitting about 514 million members around the world. In other words, about 1/16 of the people in the world would support the CCP. This shows how the party has been able to stay in power for so long. When we talk about power, let's look at how the CCP is put together. Under Xi Jinping is the Politburo Standing Committee, which is made up of 7 powerful leaders who are close to Xi. Now, if China controlled the whole world, Xi might think about making this committee's job bigger by adding more members or setting up regional standing committees in different countries. However, it's just as possible that these 7 people would still have a big impact on your life. There is another level of safety for Xi below the Standing Committee. It is the Politburo, which is made up of 25 people, 7 of whom are from the Standing Committee. These people work for the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, or the military, and are close friends of Xi. And if you're thinking about voting, don't worry. None of these levels allow it. The National People's Congress is the next stop on our tour of China's political scene. It is made up of 3,000 delegates and is responsible for making the country's laws. This Congress is made up of 5 levels: the provincial level, the quasi-provincial level, the prefectural level, the county level, and the township level. The last two, township and county, are where votes really matter. Don't get too excited, though, because you only have a few options. These are the only levels of government where you can vote, and every candidate has to be accepted by the CCP before they can even run for office. As if that wasn't enough control, the lower-level deputies you pick also vote for the higher-level ones. The system is carefully set up to make sure that only politicians and lawmakers accepted by the CCP rise to power. If China took over the whole world, the National People's Congress would probably grow a lot. Each country might be turned into a prefecture or province, with its own people elected to serve it. A bigger Congress might be too much work for Xi Jinping, though, so he might decide to keep it the same size and maybe set up some kind of regional government for the new countries that join. In this world of China, you would have almost no say in elections and almost no chance to change the way Chinese politics work. Now, let's turn our attention to the military. If China controlled the whole world, there would be no need for a force because there would be no other countries. But the military would still be very important even if China became a world power. Even if state borders were gone, people would still want to be free from CCP rule and have different cultures. As a result, the military would be responsible for maintaining internal security, which would include stopping insurgents and keeping order among people who are fighting against the CCP's rule. Each former country could have its own military branch, which would make what is already one of the strongest armies in the world even stronger. Let's look into the issue of staffing. There are about 2.54 million military forces in China right now, with about 2.035 million active soldiers and 510,000 reservists. If we use the previous ratio, where the CCP grows by 5.78 times, the Chinese military would grow to about 14.7 million people, making it the biggest army ever. This huge force would be split up based on land area and population hubs. For example, India might have a force of about 3 million people if it had the same population as China. In the same way, both Russia and the US would keep large troops, most likely at their current bases. The good news? China's military doesn't usually force people to join, unless there's a war, of course. If problems in certain areas require military action, China's Central Military Commission could use its regulations on conscription work. These rules give the military a lot of freedom to change the standards for conscription whenever they need to. For example, if a rebel group starts to gain support in the area that used to be the United States, China might use forced conscription to quickly build up the local military and put down the outbreak. The final goal would be to stay in charge and make sure that China stays in charge of the whole world. Think about another issue. Going back to your old life after joining this new global Chinese military would be very hard. Zhang Mukang, a Chinese soldier from Hainan province who tried to quit the People's Liberation Army, PLA, in December 2019, was featured on CNN. Multiple punishments were taken because of his desire. Zhang wasn't allowed to travel to other countries for 2 years, which wouldn't be a problem if China ran the whole world, but it did mean he couldn't take planes, cars, or long-distance trains within China. Therefore, he will have to stay where he is for as long as the government thinks is appropriate. Things didn't end well for Zhang after that. Along with these restrictions, he wasn't allowed to buy property, go to school, start a company, or get insurance or loans. Almost everything that was needed for a normal life outside of the service was taken away. Zhang also had to pay fines and lost money that was supposed to reimburse him for his training and living costs. He was fined $4,000. He was called a deserter and shamed in public on TV and social media. Moreover, he is permanently forbidden from having any level of government job. CNN pointed out that these kinds of harsh punishments were not usual in 2019, but they show what might happen if you leave the global Chinese military. If you join this new global Chinese military, you should serve full-time, or your life outside of work could be in danger. We'll talk about wealth next, because we consider there's much of a life left for one to live. How does the distribution of wealth affect your life in global China in particular? Also, it's not entirely accurate to think that a completely communist lifestyle means that everyone is equal and works for the good of society as a whole. This was the method until around 1978, according to the Center on China's Economy and Institutions at Stanford University. Thereafter, China has moved toward a system that is more like capitalism. Despite this, there is still a big part of income distribution that is owned by the government. As a result of debt, Stanford says that the Chinese government owns about 30% of the country's overall wealth. This is very different from the United States, where the government owns no wealth at all. However, this move toward a more capitalist model has also made big differences in wealth. Stanford points out that the top 10% of earners in China now have 41% of the country's wealth. Depending on where you live in this new global China, this could be good for your money. People in the top 10% of the U.S. income tax bracket own 45% of all the money in the country. In comparison, a global China might seem more fair. But in France, the richest 10% own 32% of the wealth, which suggests that there would be a bigger wealth gap there if China became a world power. So, when the whole world turns into China, your finances might not change that much. But there are other things to think about. According to Statista, China does not have a minimum salary that is predetermined. There is a significant amount of variation in pay that is based on the work, the company, the gender, and the area. Even if there was an increase in the minimum wage from 2012 to 2022, it is still low in comparison to what it is in the majority of developed countries. The average salary in China in 2022 was 114,029 yuan, which is equivalent to around $15,704 USD. The Bureau of Labor Statistics of the United States of America reports that the average annual wage in the United States is $59,284. In comparison to that amount, this is a significant decrease. Even so, this sum is still higher than the typical pay in a number of countries that are considered to be poor. Statista says that 19.3% of China's people make less than $10,000 a year, and 65.6% make between $10,000 and $100,000. A lot of people in this group probably make a lot less than the U.S. average. Good news! 14.5% of people make between $100,000 and $1 million a year, and 0.6% make more than $1 million a year. If China completely took over the world, your finances would depend on your job, your gender, where you live, and your business. As you might expect in most countries, working in a high-demand field like tech and being in charge will lead to better pay. Differences in gender and region are what really cause problems. Since most of China's wealth is in its big cities, people who live in places like London, New York, or Paris, which used to be global hubs, are likely to have better incomes than people who live in smaller cities and townships. This pattern fits with how income is distributed in many developed countries. The pay gap between men and women in the new global China could have a big effect on your finances. Reports show that the pay gap between men and women is pretty big. An investigation from Cornell University in 2015 found that women made only 71.57% of what men made in the same jobs. It's possible that this difference has gotten worse over time. China fell from 57th place in the World Economic Forum's rankings of gender pay equality in 2006 to 106th place by 2020, according to a 2024 study released in the journal PLOS ONE. The pay gap between men and women is also getting bigger. People who are women may find that they have a smaller share of the wealth in this new global China. Even so, you should still be able to buy food and other daily needs. However, where you live in this huge empire will have a big effect on your overall finances. According to the World Food Program, WFP, China has about 200 million tenant farmers who are in charge of 95% of the country's farmland. This means that about 1/7 of the population works in agriculture, which means that if you live in a green area, you probably work on a farm. Using the 5.78 factor from earlier, this means that under the new global Chinese system, about 1.156 billion people would become shareholder farmers. You won't own the land you work on, which is a shame. In China, shareholder farmers give big cooperative groups the rights to their land, which is a lot like renting land. They get shares in the cooperative in return, but these shares don't give them many benefits. You can't sell your land or use it as collateral for loans if you don't own it. If you work as a shareholder farmer in China today, you might be stuck in this job for life. Let's shift our attention from farming to the problem of malnutrition. The World Food Program, WFP, says that 150.8 million people in China are poor, which means that 9.4% of children are not growing as fast as they should. By applying these numbers to the whole world, we can see that about 624,000 people would be malnourished if China controlled the whole world. This is a little more than the 828 million people the World Health Organization predicted would be hungry in 2021. There is a 10% chance that someone living in this world in China would have trouble getting enough food. We can learn more about this by looking at data on how many calories people eat. A study from 2023 by the University of Oxford found that China has the 35th highest calorie intake in the world, with each person eating an average of 3,378 calories every day. This is less than places like Ireland, 3,851 calories, and the United States, 3,868 calories. People in a number of big countries such as Italy, France, Israel, Canada, the UK, and Russia would eat fewer calories every day. But China's ranking of 35th means that people in about 150 countries would eat a lot more calories every day. Their daily calorie intake of 1,642 would more than double, which would be the biggest change in the Central African Republic. Therefore, a global China might improve the food conditions in developing countries as long as the people who live there are treated the same as people who live in mainland China. Access to water is another thing to think about. Worldometers says, do not have access to clean drinking water, which puts the country in second place in the world. Using our earlier figure of 5.78 billion as a guide, this means that about 362.5 million people around the world are having trouble with water. However, this number is a big improvement over the current world situation, in which about 1/3 of people do not have access to clean drinking water. The number from China that seems very high is actually not as high as it seems because of its very large population. China has 4.5% of its people who don't have access to clean water, which is a much lower number than countries like Ethiopia, 42.7%, and Tanzania, 44.4%. If the whole world were China, water problems might get better in many countries that used to be in Africa. So, even though an extra 45 million people could be malnourished, the world water problem might get better overall. But this change isn't perfect, because water might not be distributed evenly. The benefits might not be spread out evenly if the global Chinese government doesn't make sure that everyone has equal access to clean water. Another connected topic is that if the world were all Chinese, your diet would change a lot. Noodles and rice would become everyday foods that you would eat almost every day. In these rice and noodle dishes, meats and vegetables are usually given in small pieces that are easy to bite into. There would still be sweets to choose from, with Chinese shops selling a wide range of sweet buns and pastries. You could use different flavors, like red bean paste, coconut cream, or egg custard inside these buns. And they could be changed to fit local tastes and ingredients. In China, counterfeiting is a big problem that affects the safety and realness of food items. The problem includes fake names that trick people and foods that have been changed to include harmful chemicals or other unwanted things. Even though the National Food Safety Law was passed in 2009, it is not very successful as a rule. It has a hard time keeping fake and tampered food from getting to the market. If China controlled the whole world, these problems would probably not go away, which could make food safety worries worse. The law would still be in effect around the world, but it might be hard to police, especially in places with few regulations. This means that food safety and validity could become big issues, which would lower the quality and trustworthiness of the food supply as a whole. The number and severity of food safety violations in China raise serious concerns about how safe the food supply is. The fact that there were 500,000 recorded food safety violations in 2016, such as the use of gutter oil and contaminated rice, shows that there are problems with how food is regulated and enforced as a whole. Hundreds of thousands of babies were hurt, and some died in the 2008 baby formula scam. This incident was especially scary because it not only broke rules about food safety, but also put the lives of vulnerable people in danger. If China were in charge of the whole world, these problems might affect everyone. Food safety rules might not always be followed, even if there are laws in place like the National Food Safety Law. Assuring the safety and authenticity of food items would be very hard and could have a big effect on public health. There are various other cases, for instance. During the month of December 2021, customs officials in Nigeria found about 100 bags of fake plastic rice that they thought came from China. In January 2017, officials in Tianjin shut down a network of 50 small factories that were making fake seasonings and making $14.5 million a year from selling them. This brings up an important food safety problem. If China took over the whole world, you might not be able to eat enough, and you might not be sure if the food you're eating is real because there wouldn't be enough government control. In a global China, deception could become normal. China is the world's center for counterfeiting. U.S. Customs and Border Protection said that 75% of the fake and illegal goods it confiscated in 2021 came from China. As a result of letting foreign investors in 1978, China has become the world's industrial powerhouse. Nowadays, about 70% of China's exports are made goods, which helps to keep the counterfeiting culture strong. Chinese rule over the whole world would make this culture of counterfeiting grow to meet the demand for high-end goods and names around the world. The same is true for goods. In an unregulated system more focused on profit than originality, it would be hard to tell the difference between real goods and cheap copies. Some of these people might even hire you to work for them. Working on the black market could be a lot more rewarding than farming or being in the military, which pays less. Now let's talk about something more entertaining. How would you spend your free time if everything was China? You might do Tai Chi in the park in the morning. This is a famous early morning activity that is great for stretching and sets a good mood for the day. In the evenings, you could relax in a tea house, play mahjong at one of the many mahjong parlors, or even start square dancing, a fun activity that has roots in China's Song dynasty but is still very popular today. You could also enjoy more Western things, like going to the movies or surfing the web. In the world of China, on the other hand, you'd have to deal with censorship. The strict control laws, which are sometimes called the Great Firewall of China, are one reason the CCP has been in charge for so long. Even if the whole world were China, this amount of censorship would still be in place everywhere. The Ministry of Information Industry would put in place rules that limit access to different materials. Internet access providers, ISPs, approved by the Chinese government, provide all of the routers that people in China use. These routers come with lists of URLs and keywords that are blocked and already installed. At the ISP level, versions of both are blocked to stop people from seeing material that the CCP thinks is inappropriate. ISPs also use software to enforce these rules, making sure that only material that has been approved can be seen. Therefore, in a world run by China alone, it would be very hard to find any media that was critical of the CCP because it has so much power. In a world run by China alone, where does this leave us? It would be a place with little to no freedom, since everything people do and think needs to be approved by the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party might try to blend in with the cultures of the countries it takes over, but this would require big changes to how things are run. Because there will be less oversight and fewer jobs and food options, market fraud is likely to rise. On the good side, better access to clean drinking water could help the world's poorest areas. A lot of people could also find work in the military, especially since the CCP might start using it for domestic problems. This brings up a very important question. Could you handle the huge change in culture that would come with a global China? What good and bad things do you think might happen? And would you join the large group of people who are likely to want to fight Chinese rule?